Hi, I'm Alexander Sari. In this talk, I want to make the argument that behavior science can help to improve the governance of advanced AI. Holden Karnofsky, in his series The Most Important Century, makes the argument that this can't go on. And Toby Ord in The Precipice says that if all goes well, human history is just beginning. The development and use of artificial intelligence holds great promise and risk, and there's good reason to believe that things might soon become much better or much worse for humanity. In this talk, I want to make the argument that the decision-making and behaviors that we, about how to develop and use AI now, as in this decade and certainly in this century, could have outsized impacts on how to successfully navigate the transition to a world with advanced AI systems. Alan Defoe writes, quote, AI governance relates to how decisions are made about AI and what institutions and arrangements would help those decisions to be made well, end quote. In my opinion, behaviors are the observable actions that result from decisions. They're things like apply to work at Anthropic, the AI safety company, or make AI development records available for third-party auditors, or press the button that authorizes the activation of Skynet. What this means is that good human decision-making and behaviors about how to develop and use AI can steer us towards a much better world with more well-being and flourishing. And bad human decision-making and behaviors about how to develop and use AI can steer us towards a much worse world with poorer well-being and less flourishing. Now, just talking about what it might look like to transition to a world with advanced AI systems. One thing that I've noticed in discussions of advanced AI and AI safety is a kind of technological determinism. And this story is, one day AGI will come and we need to ensure that it understands human values correctly the first time because there are no second chances. If this view is correct, then maybe the only behavior change or decisions that matter are of elites at the top AI development organizations or in a handful of policy actors in large states or nations. But another perspective, especially from people who've studied other kinds of major transitions and transformations, such as steam power, electricity, the internet, emphasize that it's not only about technical or technology elements, there's also a social element of these kinds of transitions, or sometimes called transformations. And one piece of academic jargon and discipline that engages with this idea is the idea of socio-technical transitions. And I think that the transition to AI is one such socio-technical transition. So on the technical side, this might include things like access to compute, or the algorithmic architecture. And the social side definitely involves laws or policies and actions by powerful groups, but it also involves things like changes in consumer practices, or the viability of different types of business models and sectors, and even cultural meanings and values of what's seen as important. And the social and technical changes are interdependent, which means that they influence each other. So individual, community, and societal changes will accompany the growth and spread of AI technology, because public attitudes and political decisions will influence how AI is developed and used, and the pervasiveness and sophistication of AI will influence how individuals and communities communicate, work, or live. Narrow examples or narrow AI examples of this sort of influence or interdependence could be that as capabilities increase, then the gain from misuse increases, and therefore the certain types of actions that are more prevalent will change. Or it could be that privacy concerns, perhaps from some sort of social changes or social behaviors, will limit the use of some kinds of training data. If we think beyond narrow AI, we could also consider things like advanced AI starting to displace labor by being able to essentially do all of the tasks that a person would be able to do. And that would both have sort of direct economic consequences, but also influence other types of social elements, such as the values that we place on work, or what it means to be a person with dignity or a place in society. And social can also influence technical. For example, if there's a non-proliferation treaty, or inspections or certain types of ways in which legislative requirements require AI to be developed and deployed, then that might influence the capabilities or the architecture that's used. So the upshot is that this is a complex picture, but there are many concrete opportunities to understand and shape the threads of these transitions. And many of these opportunities involve influencing decision-making and behavior. So returning to one influential definition of AI governance, and to give the full quote, Alan Defoe writes that, quote, "AI governance concerns how humanity can best navigate the transition to a world with advanced AI systems. It relates to how decisions are made about AI and what institutions and arrangements would help those decisions to be made well," end quote. And so from this socio-technical perspective, then one way that I like to think about it is that AI governance is really about trying to work in the social space in order to influence positive technical changes, and that in turn can influence positive social changes or outcomes, and so on in a virtuous cycle. But of course, it's not that easy. There are lots of different challenges in this successful transition, and here's just 4. So one is that this problem is just massively complex and difficult. The interdependence of the technical and the social means that it's very difficult to figure out where you should even start to try and intervene. And you can spend a long time stuck in trying to prioritize where to intervene, be paralyzed by trying to do more sort of macro strategy research, or just flailing around and spending a lot of time and resources doing things that you don't know are really having any impact at all. It can also be very difficult to coordinate action on the topic. There's lots of activities already that come from different disciplinary perspectives, legal perspective or technical engineering perspectives, policy, or even philosophical perspectives. And they use different language and propose different sort of focuses of the sort of work that should be done. And solutions that are seen as feasible by some groups are dismissed as being useless or worse than useless by other groups. And then it's also very difficult to assess progress. So a lot of the discourse around AI safety is that it's something that's very difficult to predict, and it's also something to determine whether we're getting any closer. This sometimes is because there's opaque or maybe missing theories of change for a lot of the activity in this space in terms of how those activities will create outputs that lead to outcomes that are reducing risk. But it's also because some of these interventions are so kind of far-reaching that it's just very difficult to quantify the impacts. So the EU AI Act, will it reduce X risk? And finally, it can be quite hard to sell advanced AI or existential risk to the typical stakeholders that need to take action in this space. X risk or global catastrophic risk framing can seem weird, outside the Overton window of kind of typical things that should be considered in policy or where solutions would be relevant for policy. And most attention, when it is on AI, is focused on very contemporary policy issues like privacy or equity or transparency, things that are more specific to narrow AI. So these challenges are quite daunting, but I have been heartened to see great works from initiatives and organizations that have been really trying to identify and establish interventions that can help reduce the risk or increase the benefits from advanced AI. At a very sort of high level, the idea is identifying different kinds of interventions that might be useful and try and make them adopted, perhaps from a sort of legal practice perspective, a corporate policy perspective, or in legislation. And that will lead to reduced risk or more benefits from AI. But I do think there's a gap in this. And I think that gap is what people and groups actually do in response to the implementation of a policy, or even how they might react to the idea of different types of interventions in that space. And it's also the case that what people and groups do, that's the thing that makes the risk reduce, right? That's the specific sorts of outcomes or practices, that change that reduce the likelihood of, say, developing unsafe AI, or you need compliance with certain types of laws or policies. And so, as my colleague Peter Slattery writes, quote, "It's easy to get lost in big abstract explorations and explanations of problems, but wherever you look at them under the microscope, you usually see groups of individuals behaving in certain ways due to certain beliefs, incentives, and frictions that need to change," end quote. And so that's exactly where I see behavior science as relevant. So behavior science investigates how humans, including individuals, organizations, and policy actors, make decisions and maintain or change their behavior. It considers individual and social influences on behavior, and emphasizes testing and evaluating what works. And so the promise of behavior change when it comes to the challenge of AI governance is that it, I think, really links in with some of these elements that make AI governance so difficult. So behavior science has the opportunity to cut through complexity. It is intentionally reductionist. It tries to accept and acknowledge and grapple with complexity. And then it says, okay, well, what are the actual behaviors or actions that are happening in this context, and who exactly is doing them? And so it offers practical methods and tools to try and improve the situation. When it comes to the difficulty of coordinating action, I think that behavior science can help to coordinate action. It can align different perspectives and create a shared understanding of a concrete problem using framing questions such as who needs to do what differently if we want to achieve a valued outcome. When it comes to measuring progress, well, one good thing about behaviors is that they are observable actions. They're not attitudes or sentiment. They're things that could be measured or counted, tracked over time to see if they're increasing or decreasing. And often there's existing data that captures behavior change, or you could establish new frameworks or ways of measuring behavior change and see, is it the case that your activities are having an influence on the issue by, say, counting the change in behavior? And finally, behavior science, or sometimes called behavioral insights when it's used in government and corporate, is highly credible to stakeholders. This approach is widely used in government and organizations, both to design, but also to implement policies and programs for other topics, whether it's social inclusion, health and environment, climate change, taxation, things like that. So what I'd like to do is just describe how a behavioral theory of change could help to make concrete progress on some of the issues or challenges in AI governance. And so going back to this idea of there being certain types of interventions that could be policies or laws or initiatives, and the overall challenge or impact that you're hoping to achieve, what you could do is you could enrich the theory of change to draw on behavior science theory and high quality evidence. And so, for example, if you identified the specific behaviors, prioritize the ones that were most important, and then specified it in a way that could be measured, then you could coordinate action and make success or progress more measurable. You could also look at what are the things that lead to that behavior being more or less likely. And so sometimes we call this diagnosing the behavior. And if you figure out why that behavior does or doesn't happen, then that can also reveal assumptions or allow you to test the effectiveness of different interventions to see whether they're addressing those influences on behavior. So the example that I'd like to just explore in a short time today is this idea of audit trails in AI development firms. So there was a recent paper in Science in 2021 by Avin and colleagues, and this included staff from Center for Study of Existential Risk, OpenAI, the Center for Governance of AI, and other organizations and universities. And the name of this paper was Filling Gaps in Trustworthy Development of AI. And in this paper, the authors argue that there are ethics frameworks and principles that exist for trustworthy development of AI. So the what has been established a bit. But there's not much yet concrete definition of how organizations can live up to these principles. And in fact, in the paper, they write, quote, "There is thus an urgent need for concrete methods that both enable AI developers to prevent harm and allow them to demonstrate their trustworthiness through verifiable behavior," end quote. So if we take this idea, or one of the ideas in that paper that could help with trustworthy development of AI, one of the ideas that was proposed was that AI development firms start to keep track of that development process and create audit trails that could be looked at by third-party auditors. So in this case, what we might do is we might say, bringing together different groups, we might try and agree on what's the specific practice or behavior that we want to change. And so just hypothetically, the example here might be firms that develop AI keep records during the development process to share with a third-party auditor. And once we've specified the target behavior, then what we could do is look at several different categories of influences on that behavior. So one of the types of influences might be things like, is there an awareness that this is a behavior that even needs to be done? And is there knowledge and skill within the person or the organization to be able to enact that behavior? So for example, perhaps through work you found that you need to know how to comply with this requirement, as well as know whether or in fact have the staff to implement that action. You also might want to ask, does the social and physical context make it possible? So what is the political environment or social environment that this person or organization is operating in? And so therefore, what are the sorts of things that might influence their behavior in that environment? So things like, what are their peers doing? Or are they already required to comply in other legislation or other sorts of needs around preserving the privacy of customer data that might make it more difficult, or for them to perceive it to be more difficult, to keep those records that they would then share with an auditor. And another category of influences on behavior could be whether the person or the organization feels the need to do it, or whether they want to do it, whether they believe that the consequences of doing it are sort of positive for them. And so one issue might be a concern around the loss of competitive advantage by the additional resources required to comply in this way, or an awareness and a kind of willingness to avoid or to in fact incur the financial consequence of non-compliance. So these are just ideas for different influences on the behaviors. But one of the things that I want to, I suppose, emphasize is that this process by which you try and specify the target behavior, the who needs to do what differently, and then unpack and investigate different influences on behavior can be a very powerful way of making concrete progress on the issue of how do you actually get somewhere with increasing the uptake of these sorts of practices. And so if we zoom out, or if we connect some of these influences and behaviors into this wider theory of change, then it also gives you a chance to figure out, okay, well, what might actually work to reduce the risk or increase the benefits from advanced AI? So again, as a hypothetical example, there are lots of AI safety fellowships that are being used to try and skill up or improve engineer, technical and governance interested people in some of these activities or practices. And so in fact, through those fellowships, that might increase the number of staff available to implement some practice like this. And so then that intervention would have an influence on the behavior and therefore an influence on the challenge. It could also be that this issue around the conflicting need to preserve privacy of customer data is something that just doesn't have yet any work that's done to try and address this issue. And so that's a gap. That would be something that could perhaps be addressed by future policy development, or at least by a change in terms of the policy implementation, so as to be able to address that influence on behavior. And then finally, it might or might not be the case that the policy or the guidelines that are put into place already have a financial consequence of non-compliance. And so a policymaker or an actor might be trying to determine what's the appropriate fine for a violation in order to make that financial consequence of non-compliance sort of sufficient enough to change the behavior. And so that could also be a fruitful space for applied research, is investigating what fine would actually be sufficient. So then I hope that by working through this concrete example, it begins to show how it is that the application of behaviour science can make concrete progress on some of these issues of AI governance. I mean, in this talk, I've really only scratched the surface of how I think it can help. And there'd be lots of other ways in which behaviour science could help as well. Could be synthesizing published evidence and rich practice or practitioner expertise to try and understand the options or identify, try and understand the problem and identify options for policies and programs. It could also be about trying to prioritize which topics or which behaviours are most important, perhaps ones that have the highest impact on the issue and are easiest or most tractable to change. You could be conducting trials to test the effectiveness of different interventions, and you could scale up and measure what works in different contexts or with different behaviours or different audiences. So this is just one place I think that behaviour science can help. And in fact, I think that it's also really relevant even earlier in the policy pipeline, so to speak. And so I'll just leave you with this idea that it really comes down to good human decision-making and behaviour that can lead to a lot higher well-being and flourishing in the future. Stuart Russell writes in Human Compatible, quote, "To AI, we will need to add ideas from psychology, economics, political theory, and moral philosophy. We'll need to melt, reform, and hammer those ideas into a structure that will be strong enough to resist the enormous strain that increasingly intelligent AI systems will place on it." End quote. And I believe that behaviour science and other social and applied human sciences can help to build that structure, and in doing so, help to successfully navigate the socio-technical transition to a world with advanced AI, one with much more well-being and flourishing than we enjoy today. Thanks.